Welcome to Emil Amok's Takeout, the podcast. I'm your host, Emil Guillermo. Emil Amok to you. I'm an award-winning journalist, columnist, news commentator, analyst, the first Asian American Filipino to host a national news program in 1989 at NPR's All Things Considered. And while there, I did a story on Stockton, California. I worked there as a print reporter. I've written about Stockton's history. Today's show is about the community's fight for environmental justice. What communities of color are doing to right the wrongs of the past. That freeway destroyed your neighborhood because you weren't valued. But things are changing. Now a group called Little Manila Rising out of Stockton is becoming a model for what a nonprofit can do to help its community be seen and heard. In my career, I've done a few episodes on Little Manila Rising so far. It's from the very beginning in 2003-04, when it was just Little Manila, not Rising. But it's changed, and its story shows a continuing evolution of the community getting stronger, just as Little Manila gets stronger. In previous episodes of this podcast, I talked to co-founder Dylan Delvo about how Little Manila Rising began as Little Manila, essentially to preserve the legacy buildings where Filipino immigrants built a life in the 1920s and 30s. And it really was the center of the Filipino-American community in the United States, a community as large, or the largest outside of the Manila, that existed. Even bigger than San Francisco for a time, because most Filipinos went from San Francisco to Stockton for the jobs, to work the ag. And so Little Manila began to preserve the buildings in the area. Little Manila, the district, putting up signs on corners saying about the historical significance of the buildings. But then its focus shifted, a focus on youth, to teach them the cultural history of Filipinos in America through stories, dance, and food in the public schools and in after-school settings. As the organization began to grow, it expanded yet again to public health, hastened by the COVID crisis. It just completed its part in a door-to-door get-out-the-vaccine effort throughout Stockton, but also raised its own community's vaccination rates to near 70%. In this episode, we talk about the effort to mitigate the low ranking of South Stockton as the area with one of the worst air quality in the state, and not coincidentally, the highest asthma rate in California. It's possibly because the state raised the Little Manila community, RAZED, raised, and other adjacent ones to put in what is now known as the Crosstown Freeway, connecting State Highway 99 on the east with Interstate 5 on the west, as well as the Port of Stockton. Now think about that. Two freeways with trucks and cars spewing air pollution, plus a port with heavy polluting ships idling in wait. The whole thing is a monumental cesspool of air pollution. Little Manila Rising has become more active, engaging with government as well as the community to make sure that the health hazards from the freeway are monitored, controlled, and abated. And the man in charge of that aspect is Little Manila Rising's Matt Holmes. We talk about the project for air monitoring, making smart green spaces in the city, and the project that it's just begun with UC Merced to monitor air from Stockton through the valley to Merced. Matt has done some of the work before, some of the environmental justice work in Richmond, California. But as he explains, he is committed to Stockton and Little Manila Rising. And part of it is that Little Manila Rising's co-founder, along with Dylan Delvo, was the late Dawn Buholano Mabalan, who herself died of asthma. Holmes talks about how Dawn was his teacher. Here's my interview with Little Manila Rising's Matt Holmes on Emil Amuk's Takeout. You knew Dawn Mabalan at San Francisco State.
That's right. She was one of my 3 graduate advisors for my comprehensive exam. And she actually was the instructor for one of my applied research internships while I was at San Francisco State. And so my relationship to Little Manila, though, goes back further to my relationship with my wife, Brianna, who was born and raised in Stockton because her dad got a football scholarship out here in 1975. And they loved UOP and loved Stockton and never left. And they're the town's biggest boosters. So I've been coming here since 1999, since the last millennium, and have really always loved being in Stockton. But first really learned about the historic significance of Stockton while attending graduate school at San Francisco State. Dawn was, I think Little Manila in the Heart hadn't quite been published yet when I first became aware of her. I don't remember its publishing date, but was aware that there was this individual who became quite a dynamo highlighting the contributions of Filipino Americans. And it was at a time when I was doing graduate internships with the U.S. National Park Service in the Presidio. And the first project that I was drawn to in the National Park Service really led me here. And that was the Buffalo Soldiers so-called Minority Stewardship Program in the Presidio, led by Ranger Rick Penn, and which was co-developed with Shelton Johnson out of Yosemite National Park. And it was in learning about the experiences of Black frontier soldiers that I heard these really powerful stories of humanity and decolonization from Black soldiers who couldn't rest well with the knowledge that they were being used to colonize other brown people for a white imperial force, and some of whom defected from the United States and joined Filipino so-called insurgents. And so it was at that time that I started to learn about Dawn and started to learn about the historic Little Manila neighborhood, but really didn't have a chance to take a full bite out of that apple until really just a few years ago when, fast forward 6 or 7 years, I've moved to Stockton, but I have a job in Richmond, helping to launch Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park, which was really the story of how women and people of color helped win World War II. And one of my student trainings, a student career internship program participant, Amanita Tosiga, I think her Latino last name was Cornejo, was just a proud Panay and was learning all about her own culture and history, and just kept saying, "Matt, what are you doing here? You should be working for Little Manila. Do you know what they're doing out there?" And she was like, "This is Dawn." I said, "Oh yeah, I know Dawn. It's old news to me," I thought, right? But I didn't know about the pivot that Little Manila had gone through with the turn towards environmental justice and social justice and education reform. I was a fool teacher who should have listened to his student earlier, made the move to head towards Stockton as far back as 2011 or 2012. But it's good that I didn't, because I actually got skills that Little Manila could use in the intervening 7 years in Richmond, where I launched an environmental justice program within the National Park Service that then evolved into a partnership with a community-based organization called Groundwork Richmond. And we did urban forestry work that evolved into air quality work, air quality monitoring, and then policy work and watchdogging work. And so it was really during those first crazy months of the pandemic where regular operations in Richmond had ground to a halt. But I was still participating feverishly in the state of California's the Air Resources Board AB 617 project in Richmond. I was one of their first grantees and ended up receiving $800,000 from the Air Resources Board to launch a citizen science project training young people from the neighborhood to monitor their own air. And if only it had remained that simple. But quickly I learned that this was a much more complicated pathway into policy work in California's relationship with cap and trade and the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. So I was really realizing that there was a need for sort of forthright advocates at the state and regional level who actually understood communities, but who could basically talk white to white agencies. And my sense of entitlement really helped me advocate for communities that I'd been working in for several years. And it was in that process where I was contending with all the interests that are involved in air pollution and air monitoring that I realized that my own home had been designated an AB 617 community, and that my two daughters were growing up in one of the 13 worst polluted places in all of California. And really, it's the worst polluted place in all of California. It's South Stockton. My wife and I bought a home in South Stockton, south of Harding, north of the Channel, north of Highway 4, not to conflate the two. But South Stockton, as far as most privileged folks are concerned in Stockton, and realized that the work I was doing was really personal as well. And so I started attending AB 617 meetings, and Dylan Delvo was sitting in these meetings.
Yeah.
And I could sense that there was really a palpable outrage at the way the process was being conducted. And I tried to join the committee, and I was a legitimate resident of the community. And in my opinion, felt like I had a right to join the community, but was told there was no room at the end for Matt. Because I had tried to join too late, even though they had just had a call for new community members. And I'm not sure what that was. And maybe it was because I was known to local agencies through my work in Richmond and through CARB. I certainly suspected that. And I was pretty frustrated by that rejection, and continued to attend just as a member of the general public. When I got a chance to have a conversation with Dylan, one-on-one. And he felt like I could represent this work better in that committee. And so even though they wouldn't allow me to join as a community member, Little Manila Rising had an organizational seat on the steering committee. And so he hired me and designated me as their representative. And it was the fastest change of direction in my life that I'd been through, since kids, of course. And quickly found myself as the fourth employee of Little Manila Rising, which my daughter, who was young, very young last year, would always pronounce as Little Vanilla, because that was the word that she recognized. And I don't know, it was obviously, I stick out like a sore thumb, the first Anglo employee of the company, and I'm just proud to be included in this really cool story.
Well, you are the right person at the right time, because as you described it, a lot of your skills, a lot of your experience in the environment come into play. And I didn't realize that you only met Dylan attending these CARB AB 617 meetings. And we're going to get into that because that's a significant thing in the Valley, especially in terms of environmental justice. But this is, like I said, you're the right person at the right time, because a lot of people do not understand environmental justice. And you are right there at the grassroots with your work that you did in Richmond. And now that you work here, just letting people know that, because a lot of people just take for granted clean air, clean water. Oh, the air is going to be dirty now. The water is going to be dirty. That's just the way it goes. That's the breaks. But it's not. There is racism involved in the decisions that give people dirty water, not clean water.
I'll tell you, like, Dylan, the filmmaker, understands environmental justice better than anyone I've ever met. I've been working for the National Park Service and with EPA partners and grassroots, EJ, nonprofits all around the country. And they all, almost to a T, approach this work from an environmental standpoint, where they're adapting white environmentalism to a community of color. But that's not what environmental justice is. Environmental justice is a historic framework for understanding environmental pollution burdens. And so when you come to this from a social sciences standpoint, it all makes a whole lot more sense. It's no accident that there's 70 stationary sources located in South Stockton that require a permit, 15 of which require a FEMA emergency evacuation plan, and that those aren't next to nice folks' homes, right? And then you add on top of that, California's primary crime and environmental justice has been transportation planning and the white violence of freeways that were used under the auspices of national defense and modernization to displace and segregate communities of color all across the state of California. But the injury in Stockton is particularly pointed. The Highway 4 was used to destroy neighborhoods and wasn't even bothered to be completed, and has never fulfilled its logistics promises or its economic development promises. The only thing it did effectively was destroy a historic community. That was by design.
When you mention Highway 4, aka the Crosstown Freeway,
yeah,
and it connects Highway 99 to Highway 5, cuts across that a large part of Stockton that were once thriving communities of color, like Goat Hill, like south of Little Manila. And I notice now people are just coming to terms with that. They're understanding that, especially when the talk is about, we're going to build back better and have this infrastructure plan and we're going to build this and that. People are understanding, there's a reason why these freeways have gone through areas and have displaced communities and have given the communities that have stayed, mostly people of color, the bad air and the bad environmental circumstances. And it really is amazing, because you wouldn't have heard this 20 years ago.
No, you would have had agencies dismiss it. And you still have agencies trying to dismiss this history, but the facts are too overwhelming. The public health outcomes and the mortality rates alone, are so divergent from privileged white communities across North America that anybody interested in alleviating human suffering would have asked the question, why? But the way power is construed in the United States, it's okay to have throwaway communities. And really, most of our economic system is dependent on, externalizing costs and having disposable communities that can absorb those costs and pollution burdens. I mean, we have a host of activities here in Stockton that are very profitable, but they don't serve us. This is a warehouse for the Bay Area, so that sustainable residents in San Francisco can get a bamboo toothbrush delivered in one day's notice. But that's relying on thousands of trucks idling next to our kids, and truck driving schools driving down our neighborhood streets to train a future truck driver at the expense of my kids' lungs and our neighbors' lungs. Port of Stockton is a major player in international politics. The shipping of produce and grain and fertilizers in and out of California is a globally significant trade that generates massive amounts of wealth. And unfortunately, far too little of that wealth sticks to the Stockton that it passes through. There's a host of other examples of that. I-5 should enrich the communities that it bisects, and it doesn't up and down the state. We really do have a transportation system that is designed for some people at the expense of others. And it goes back to that social sciences and really even a humanities understanding that nothing about us without us could ever be for us. And so raising people's awareness around that has been my work for several years, but I have never had sort of a toehold to work with like Little Manila. What Dylan and Don did here over the past 20 years was journeyman credibility building work. They made like tough decisions at the expense of their own ease and success because they were the right decisions to make. And their credibility is is the foundation of everything that we're doing right now. It was why I was able to take my policy blathering work and talk to other agencies that are, as you said, are now have to contend with this narrative that history is why the outcomes are unequal. So I'm able to sit down with the Office of Environmental Health Hazards Assessment and say, yeah, you can work in Stockton. We can be part of your lab if your work is relevant to us. And Matt Holmes couldn't do that. Little Manila Rising could do that. The same was true when a lot of our work is pointing in this direction of running these errands to prove that pollution is injuring us, which we already know is true. But the correlation between pollution and public health outcomes still has these quasi, scientific variables in it that allow people to dodge responsibility for what they're doing to us.
The thing is, though, you make it a grassroots thing where people's awareness and knowledge is able to combat the bureaucrats and be able to maybe try to direct or enhance policy, which starts off not being good enough, but becomes better with community involvement.
That's the hope. Yeah, that really is the hope. I mean, from 30,000 feet, I shouldn't have to do any of this work. We know that pollution is destroying people's bodies and they're dying younger, and they're dying younger from pollution that was put on them through racist policies. As a history worker, I can say that unequivocally in complete confidence. But in negotiating with white institutions like the state of California, you still kind of have to prove it because they're not, power concedes nothing. And so, as we raise awareness and we solve this problem of power by getting more people to care about these issues, that's how we make systems change. But it's really distasteful to build power slowly over decades and not help the people that are at risk right now. And so the strategy that we've settled on is really how do we help people immediately while also building that political power. And so I'm really proud of the two projects that we're wrestling with right now around community air monitoring and urban greening, which are both going to change the power dynamic, both in a sense of wealth and awareness, but also provide meaningful co-benefits to residents right here and right now.
So let's take it one at a time. Let's take the air monitoring, because we mentioned that first. That's really key. You need to know what exists, right? You need to know how bad is it. So how bad is the air in Stockton and maybe specifically Little Manila?
Yeah, well, the most definitive data you could point to is something called CalEnviroscreen, which is the Office of Environmental Health Hazards Assessments tool. And it's a tool that overlays economic assets with public health outcomes. And the poorer you are, the more you die. No surprise to anybody. And the more you suffer from public health indicators like asthma and cardiac disease and you name it. And so that'll tell you that Little Manila, its neighborhood, sits in the 98th or 96th percentile because they split it on a census tract. And that those percentages are increasing since CalEnviroscreen 3.0 was released several years ago, and the new CalEnviroscreen 4.0, which is in draft form and should be finalized soon. Our pollution has gotten worse since we knew we were at the top of the percentage scale. We have 100th pollution burden percentiles in downtown Stockton, and they're all clustered around Highway 4, I-5, 99, and the Port of Stockton, and significant rail activity. So it's no accident that people's garbage throwing in the sky and going into our lungs is injuring us. Now, who's responsible for which portion of pollution? Unfortunately, nobody has the answer for that. Our regulatory process in California is a self-reporting regime, where if you want a permit to operate a biomass facility, it's really a paper calculation based on the characteristics of the technology you're using there. How much are you burning, at what temperature, and what kind of an environment, and what's the expected emission from that activity. And generally those should be pretty reliable, but ask any student what kind of grades they get when they grade themselves, and generally they do better than when they get graded by the graduate TA who really wants to prove something. And I want to be graded by the graduate TA with an axe to grind, who gives everybody a worse grade than they deserve, because these grades are the difference between life and death, between vulnerable people and sensitive receptor populations. And so the truth is, nobody knows whose pollution is going where. We have rough ideas based on the self-reporting regime, and I find that it's no longer adequate to let people tell us what they think they're doing to us. And so the solution for me and for many community advocates, and this is something that's acknowledged in AB 617, is that communities need to be involved in monitoring their own air and communicating their own exposure risk to each other. Because, this, Emil, lots of communities of color don't trust public institutions, and for good reason. So, if the air district texts you to stay home, there's a good reason that most people wouldn't listen to them. We've seen this with vaccine resistance, which I'm proud to say we've been instrumental in helping to overcome that resistance in South Stockton. But around air pollution, it needs to come from a trusted source, and it really does need to come from an outside source like us that has this history of work in the community that people really trust. And so there are challenges with that, right?
Yeah, well, people don't listen. I mean, people just they don't see it. They say, well, it doesn't smell bad to me, or it might smell a little bad, but I don't see anything. But we're talking about the murderous parts of pollution are in parts per million. So you're not going to see it.
Yeah, fine particulate matter, which, politically, it has been acceptable for Central California to be out of attainment with the Clean Air Act for decades. It's okay. Stockton is out of attainment with a federal law that's enforced other places, but they'll still approve 40,000 new trucks coming to town to ship concrete dust in here. So, there's a tolerance here for exceedance that needs to be overcome. Well-off neighborhoods wouldn't allow this stuff to go on. And what that looks like is rabble-rousing at city council meetings, board of supervisor meetings, and planning commissions. But, the Little Manila story will tell you that getting into dialogue with local governments doesn't always pay dividends. We were given historic preservation designation by a city that was simultaneously signing demolition orders without disclosing that to us. We have a planning commission that continues to approve new truck warehouses because economic development is the only lens they have to look through. And they don't think the best thing we have to offer the world is to be a parking lot, according to our planning commissions. So, changing people's understanding around that and how that impacts Stockton is a huge challenge at the local agency level. I would prefer it if they would help me solve that problem. The politics out here make that really unlikely. So I'm deeply grateful, as frustrated as I am with the state of California and the federal government. I'm deeply grateful for programs that do help communities like us and organizations like us sort of step into these roles. And normally I would have tried to get funding out of the state of California or out of the regional air district to purchase monitors and train people to install them. But California took a whole year off because somebody else got a job. And so they didn't fund the community air grant portion of AB 617 for an entire year. And the Valley Air Pollution Control District refused to work with us, and so did the city of Stockton. So we found a third way to get it done, and that's by working with the Attorney General's office.
Yeah, and it really is as simple as, well, all right, so there were these bureaucratic obstacles, and all you really had to do was get someone to fund the purchase of these monitors and the training of people to use monitors, because it's as simple as putting the monitors where people are and then seeing just how bad it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, in defense of the agencies who I'm perpetually frustrated with, there's been a sea change in technology and device affordability and availability and utility. The ability to stream real-time data with a relative degree of confidence onto everyone's phone everywhere is a game changer. And, the Institute, big clunky government institutions are the last ones to adapt and be nimble. But they're coming along, and they are starting to see the value of these so-called low-cost remote sensors. And you hit on something that's really important within this regulatory framework. A regulatory framework looks at a polluter, and it sees its only intervention opportunity at the point of the permit. And I honestly don't care if you're making aluminum for the space shuttle or if you're shipping coal to Japan. I care what's going in my baby's lungs. And so the places that I care about aren't at the tip of the smokestack. They're the steps of the church. They're the playground at the schoolyard. They're the window to my daughter's bedroom when it's hot in the summer, and I want to leave the window open. So taking the science to the people and really appreciating exposure as much as agencies appreciate emissions is a conceptual flip that we're really helping to push for.
So Matt, where are you in terms of getting the air monitoring program off the ground with Little Manila Rising? Are there monitors out there?
There are. We have about a dozen out right now that are left over from they were given to us by the Central California Asthma Collaborative, who are our accomplices from Fresno. And they've been working with the Valley Air Pollution Control District. And I have to give credit. That's a part of the AB 617 project across the valley. The valley sort of grouped all the AB 617 communities together, and they sort of treated that as a community air monitoring project. Now, I should also say that when I came to town, there were 2 operational monitors, right? Catholic Charities had one up at their office, and there was one up at Washington Elementary School. And Dylan had one at his house that was actually outside of the 617 study area that had been knocked down in a windstorm. We've gotten 9 up since then at sort of crucial locations. I have about another 4 on hand that I'm putting at strategic locations. But really, I should have had 50 of these up a year ago. 50. And that was a petition I was pushing for and asking for people to appreciate, because a year really matters, right? Every minute of exposure permanently changes the genetic material of every human breathing it. Right? Telomeres in genetic material fray at the point of pollution. So every year matters, and every year of data matters. And losing this last year to, frankly, political resistance here at the local government level is a crime I'll never forget. But speaking of crime, the solution for us has been, in the absence of CARB and in the absence of leadership from Valley Air District, has been the Volkswagen settlement. The Volkswagen cheating scandal on emissions, California sued the pants off them. Attorney General Becerra led that charge and secured a major settlement from Volkswagen and gave most of that to the CARB that distributed through incentives through the regional air districts to reduce emissions. And that's what those agencies know how to do. They know how to buy and bolt on new equipment and give money to polluters to have better stuff to pollute less. But the AG's office was smart. They said, I still don't think we're getting to the bottom of how this hits communities. So they reserved $10 million for community-led air monitoring and public health exposure studies. So it required a University of California or a CSU and a community group to secure it. And that's where we're at now. We successfully partnered with the University of California Merced's Health Sciences Research Institute, and were awarded a $1.2 million grant to instrument 75 sensors in South Stockton, 75 more sensors stretching along the freeways between here, Merced, and Fresno. But more importantly, a couple of Batmobiles, mobile monitoring and mobile clinic that public health researchers and clinicians will use to do point-of-time interventions with people in respiratory distress and to correlate the pollution data that I'll be collecting with the hospitalization and distress triggers that asthma patients experience.
So this is a significant thing. This is more than $1 million. You got 150 monitors.
Yep.
sensors that you should have had a long time ago, but now you have 75 in Stockton. You got 75 between Stockton and the Valley. You got UC Merced in on this. You've got these mobile units that can care for people right on the spot if need
Yep.
be, because you're talking about real life, real time kind of respiratory issues, asthma. This is a boon for the Valley and also Little Manila Rising.
Yeah, it really is. It really is bringing science and medicine to the people with the people. And I'm just super grateful for the sort of the literacy, the social literacy, as well as the technical acumen of the researchers at UC Merced.
And when are you going to get this going? Well, how soon before it gets going?
The state of California takes a long time to turn that ship. The award was announced. I at least knew about it in early September, but we've finalized contracts and scopes of work have been approved, and we're moving to purchasing some of the equipment right away. And I want to point out that this project is going to benefit from our community partners at the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, who has really been schooling me and Stockton residents on the history of regulatory action or inaction in our region, without which none of this work would have a meaning when it comes to power. And then also the Central California Asthma Collaborative, who got us brought into AB 617 and who provided us with our initial monitors. They're also going to take all the monitors that I get with UC Merced, and they're going to calibrate them next to federal reference grade monitors. So even though anybody can buy a Purple Air and put it up on their house, you're still just hoping that the device works. And we want to make sure that people have a high degree of confidence in the data that we're sharing. So we do what's called a parking lot calibration, where we'll park 30 or 40 of these sensors together with a federal reference grade monitor that's always checked and is always right, mostly right. And we'll be able to say that all of our sensors work together. They work at the same, they detect pollution at the same levels, so that when we spread it out across Stockton and the Central Valley, we'll be able to tell people with a high degree of confidence that if we're warning you about air pollution, you can take us seriously. And that's one of the things that I want to go back to, the tradition of air monitoring. Air monitoring is generally done in these 50-kilometer grids with really expensive equipment that has to be babied and maintained. And then the data has to be cleaned for months sometimes, so that the data that has been collected always comes out too little, too late. So it'll tell you about air pollution after you've already been in it. And it's so generic for the region, it's hard for you to make any decision. So if somebody tells you it's going to be a bad day all day everywhere, and you still got stuff to do that day, sooner or later, you're going to stop paying attention to that information. But if I can give you granular information that says, hey, south of the freeway and east of the port, you're going to have unhealthy conditions up until we get to the Delta Breeze at 6 o'clock. Save your walk to the grocery store or your jog for a better time of day. Then you have some texture to the data that you're getting, and you can actually do something with it.
Well, how significant would that be to people's lives in terms of saving lives?
Yeah. Well, think about how many birthday parties, baseball games, and picnics are canceled for the rain. And most folks don't get out there and wait for it to start raining on them. We used to have rain in California. Maybe that's a bad example. But, people could check the weather and they can make an informed choice because the modeling has gotten so advanced with weather. We can do the same thing here with air quality. We know the regular sources of pollution based on that reporting data. Even if it is conservative data, we know where there are smokestacks and where they're pumping. We also know exactly where transportation facilities are and when traffic fluctuates. We can also map and model train arrivals and departures. And in Stockton, we're an inland port. So we get giant floating factories burning the dirtiest fuel in the world, fuel oil, and they show up here as a mobile source, but they'll motor in place for hours as part of an old-fashioned loading practice called hoteling. So we've got a stationary regulatory agency that doesn't even acknowledge that. That's the state's problem. And the state doesn't keep track of every ship that shows up. So I'll be able to model that ship as it arrives. I'll be able to model its engine and how much smoke it's putting in the air, and I'll be able to change how much day by day with regards to air pollution in your neighborhood.
And this is all from like an idling ship at the Stockton port, which people don't even think about, that's, polluting the air. But now with monitoring, we could point a finger and say, here's the evidence, here's the goods.
Yep, for sure. And the funny thing about, not funny, sort of the ironic and tragic thing about it is we know a lot when it benefits powerful people. So we know about the weather because that matters to everybody. And a lot of science, research, and communication capacity building has gone into that. We also know where every single ship is in the world at all times. They've all got a marine tracker. That's something we could know. We sat in a meeting with the Port of Stockton, the Valley Air Pollution Control District, and above all, the California Air Resources Board, whose job it is to monitor these mobile vessels. And we said, how many ships a year? What kinds of ships? What tier engines? Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's been 20 months. We've still never been told. Nobody can bother to follow through on that simple community request. So we got to go and buy an app from corporate shipping interests so that we can model when ships arrive and depart.
Is that just because the bureaucracy you're dealing with, in this case, the port and maybe some locals, just don't care? They don't think it's important in their mission to provide that to a community group that they see as like a dog gnawing on their leg?
Yeah, totally. I think it's going to surprise, what I'm going to say is going to surprise you. I think the port is probably the most amenable to partnering on solving this problem. Like, they understand that their bottom line is affected by how they're perceived by this community. The old days of operating without anybody knowing about you or thinking that they can do anything about you are gone. And so they want to be a green marine certified port, and they need our help to do that. And so they're good. They've once we got the governments out of the conversation, they've been a pretty responsive partner. I mean, they don't know how to like relate to a community yet, or hold meetings, or keep track of an agenda. But neither did the Valley Air District or CARB. They couldn't. They held conversations under their roof and never once held anybody accountable for promises made under that roof. And that really all goes back to CARB not knowing how to share power with communities.
CARB being, once again, let's get to the acronym CARB.
California Air Resources Board.
Okay, because there's a number of things that we should have a glossary with our podcast.
My hope is nobody has to learn these things.
Well, you're right.
At some point, they shouldn't matter.
It should just be: is the air clean? Is the water clean? We should know it. We should feel it. Oh, and if someone gets sick, we should immediately come to their attention. But bureaucracy is getting in the way of
and silos. For whatever reason, CARB manages mobile sources, and regional air districts manage stationary sources. Emil, do you care if the diesel particulate matter in your lungs fell off of a train or came out of a tailpipe or out of a smokestack?
The origin does not matter.
Yeah, me neither.
If it's inside me, I don't like the fact that it's inside me. But how did it get there? That's the thing. It's in the air. But
and this brings us full circle to where we started this conversation. Healthy communities are designed, and design is shaped by policy. And it shouldn't be a fool's errand for me to put a monitor next to every asthma household and every emission source, and then to say, you did it again. We know what they're doing. They're setting stuff on fire and selling energy to PG&E. Like that's the major stationary source of pollution in our community, is for-profit electric generation by burning grapevines that we don't grow in South Stockton, for wine we don't drink in South Stockton, which has no relationship to the logistics capacity of the Port of Stockton. It was just a politically vulnerable place that would allow a wealthy industry to set its waste on fire.
So it's the vineyards.
Well, and I mean, that's, it's all agricultural burning, but 85% of the biomass that we're burning comes from vineyards because they don't want to disentangle wire, they say, from their vines. Other parts of agriculture are getting on board with whole orchard recycling, grinding up the trees, incorporating them into the soil, which, is better for your soil, better for water, and better for your crop long term. But we don't have a long-term view when it comes to business foresight and projection in the United States. We have short-term quarterly profits, and that's what's painted us into this corner with global climate instability, let alone the hyperlocal public health outcomes that we're fighting.
So all that is so grand and global, but you can see how you can, if you look in the right places locally, you can see how all that is incorporated in the global vision. And then the other aspect is the people. How do you translate that to people so that they care, so they'll put a monitor up, so they'll listen to what the monitor says, and so they'll be part of the program so that they actually see some changes in their lives?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, global climate instability is a threat to everybody, but it's especially a threat to low-income communities of color, near infrastructure, shoreline infrastructure. Stockton has a host of threats from sea level rise, you name it. But we had a white environmentalist movement that told us to buy, ice cream cone light bulbs to save the world and to recycle our beer cans, and who lectured us about plastic bags and straws and polar bears. And, could the communities that I work in care about those things? But when you're struggling to make ends meet, you got 3 jobs and you got a kid in a subpar school, are you really going to stop what you're doing for a polar bear? Now, you are going to stop what you're doing when your kid's gasping for air, and when your school teacher's tearing apart your backpack looking for your inhaler, or you don't have an inhaler because it's so damn expensive and it only takes 8 cents to make, but it costs you $60 to own. I just met with one of our council members at her house, putting up one of our monitors, and she had $300 worth of respiratory medicine in her purse and was outraged that the medicine in her purse cost more than the purse itself, because she had the temerity to grow up in South Stockton.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to Dawn, who we lost at the age of 46, the world's leading scholar on Filipino Americans, and who was transforming dialogue around this contribution of this gigantic population in California that's still largely unseen. We're constantly in so-called Asian conversations where Filipinos still aren't seen, even though they're the vast majority of Asians in California. Dawn was changing changing the way people saw this population, was decolonizing people's minds around the history of Filipino Americans. And she died at 46 because somebody needed to save her when she was 6. Somebody needed to plant 7,000 trees between I-5 and her Conway homes. Somebody needed to make sure her public housing had sealed up infiltration measures and an air filter on it if it was going to be next to a major interstate. But they didn't, because they considered her disposable. Or like Dylan's dad, who was a labor organizer in the Central Valley and helped provide food security and dignity to thousands of food security for millions and dignity to tens of thousands of laborers, who became a senior and was put in a senior center underneath I-5, underneath Highway 4, where you can reach up and slap the tires on a heavy duty diesel truck that now has a preschool in it, where low-income kids are playing outside underneath tailpipes. So the story was bad then, the story's still bad now. These burdens were planned. It wasn't an accident, right? It wasn't like a wartime decision, like that happened in Richmond, right? There were wartime decisions that brought in Kaiser Steel to build ships that polluted the landscape and polluted the surrounding community. But that was done to kill the Nazis and the Japanese army. There was an excuse, I guess, for the lack of foresight and the substandard planning. But things like I-5 and Highway 4 and all of these stationary emission sources, these were sober, unrushed decisions made by people who were really comfortable with the amount of pollution they were putting on Black and brown children.
Yeah, and now we have, Little Manila Rising is part of this environmental justice movement. We have a way in which people, the community, can be made more aware through education, through knowledge, through science. You got the air monitoring. And then advocates like yourself, advocates like Little Manila, who will go up to the bureaucrats and speak out on behalf of, these communities of color that remain in South Stockton and in Stockton at large. So it sounds like we've solved the problem, right, Matt?
Yeah, totally. While Dylan and I try to hire somebody for, good God. So wages and wealth, power is a function of wealth, and these are all problems of power. And we still don't have the investment, and we still don't have the assets to really increase the discomfort of the powerful who routinely approve a new trucking warehouse in South Stockton. So I've got a vision for how to get there, but we're a long ways from getting there, Emil.
Yeah.
I'm proud of where we're at. It's amazing how far we've come in just 14 months.
Yeah, I'll say and at some point we're going to have a subsequent conversation just about CARB and AB 617, because that's a significant part of everything, and why there's I won't say a mandate, but why there's a direction in which Little Manila Rising is going. But as we wind down here, I mean, I think it's great that UC Merced is a partner with Little Manila to get those air monitors, and we will have subsequent conversations about those monitors. But now tell me, like, if there are 3 things that people should know now about what Little Manila is doing, what can, in our a little digest form, what should they know? So because you can't see air pollution, you can't see water pollution, you can't see, but, if they know that, okay, here's what Little Manila Rising is doing, and here's what they can do also in conjunction.
Yeah, I actually think our most transformative work is a project I'm not directly involved in, and that's our Decreasing Asthma Within Neighborhoods program, our DAWN program that Elaine Barut is leading. And it's basically a community health worker model where we're going to people's homes and we're breaking down those barriers to distrust and saying, hey, you know what? Asthma isn't normal. And you live in an overburdened environment, and there's some things you can do about that. You can control these chemicals in your home. You can control your ventilation, and you can plan for bad days, and you can use these data resources. So that DAWN program is really important. Everybody should have access. This is America. We don't have access to health care. But if you don't have health insurance, at least you can have health information. And so that is something that can take the panic out of a child's day. And if we do that once, all of our work has been worth it. I think the other thing that Little Manila is doing that's really groundbreaking is not just community air monitoring, but that correlation with public health outcomes. So the project we're calling Skywatch, where we're monitoring the air, and we're monitoring the air in concert with bona fide public health researchers and clinicians. So it's not just grumpy history teacher Matt pointing at a data that nobody can understand and assuming a correlation. There's going to be, important people with the degrees on their wall that white institutions will have to listen to. And I think the other thing that I'm really proud about, most people can't see the background behind me, is our transformative climate communities work and our urban greening work that we're now doing. So we've been able to step in and help the city of Stockton get back on track with its transformative climate communities program. And we're going to be leading the implementation of a major urban forestry project. Low-income communities across the country have had their forests denuded. Urban forests are vital and mandatory green infrastructure assets that wealthy communities would refuse to live without. But because of racism and white violence and redlining practices and zoning, low-income communities of color don't have lungs like trees. And so we're going to use all 3 of those projects, the asthma households, the data, the air pollution monitoring and dispersion modeling, how it moves around the city, to design where we plant trees. Yeah. And we're going to be planting scientifically designed you know, vegetative barriers around all of our pollution sources and all of our sensitive sites. And we're going to use God's greatest creatures, trees, to help protect future generations for generations to come.
Now, isn't that funny that a simple thing like planting a tree is the solution? The greening or having green belts or putting up a tree. I was in a conversation with some people in Boston the other day, and they were talking about how to create equality in, you know, outcomes when it gets really hot in Boston. And they said, well, the green leafy suburbs, they're green and leafy, they're cool. But in Chinatown, it's like 15 degrees hotter. So the answer in Boston was put a park in Chinatown.
Yeah, for sure. You know what's crazy is urban heat island effect is the deadliest phenomenon of global climate change.
Yeah.
People are getting cooked to death in American cities and cities around the world. And we have the technology to do something about it, but it involves an equitable sidewalk,
Yeah, right.
water, and maintenance. And, you know, communities of color didn't get big sidewalks. Those are only for the fancy folks in the avenues, right? And communities of color don't have recycled water infrastructure like people that happen to live near a golf course.
Well, wait a minute. Some suburbs, they don't want the sidewalks. They want the semi-rural feel of being.
Yeah. I don't care what they want. I just want trees and shade.
Yeah.
Because trees will shade the ground, but more than anything, I've been planting trees for over a decade for carbon sequestration power. They can suck some carbon out of the air. But what they do, what I value most about a tree, besides its beauty and what it can do for my mind, is what it does to knock down particulate matter. You know, that tree behind me is a geometric expansion of surface area for dust to stick to and to be washed down in the rain and to be knocked out of the air column. And when you plant them tightly next to a freeway, you increase the threshold that particulate matter has to overcome to float into a neighborhood. And when it gets over that wall, it tumbles down to the ground faster than if it floats off the freeway over a hot sidewalk. And it can float for, you know, thousands and thousands of feet. So with well-designed vegetative barriers, we can try to do something about these freeways that some of which should have never been built in the first place.
Yeah, you don't need high tech necessarily. You just need the best of the low tech.
Well, and getting, you know, one of the problems we're facing, Emil, and this is also true for California's greenhouse gas or carbon neutrality plan, which we should do a whole episode on, is getting engineers to appreciate nature-based systems. You know, we live on the Delta, which is the largest carbon sink in all of California. If we would just let the water run and the salmon run too, we could do a lot about climate change. But instead, we're pumping that water into cattle and almonds and grapevines and then setting those things on fire. Where was I going with that? Oh, just about nature-based solutions. But you know, that's too wishy-washy for the engineers. So they're going to figure out how to capture CO2 at all the refineries, super pressurize it till it's liquid, and inject it 7,000 feet underneath the Delta into the bedrock, because that's easier for them to calculate. Even though pipes leak, any homeowner will tell you, and the oil industry that can do that project called carbon capture and sequestration, they're the guys that cause global climate change. We're really going to pay them to solve their own problem? So, you know,
So these are issues that we got to talk about on a subsequent podcast, but I do appreciate your time today, just sharing with our audience exactly what Little Manila Rising is doing and what, you know, really it's a major thing, but it's really a small thing in the sense that it just, we need to know what's in our air. We need to monitor it so we know what kind of attention to give it. And I'm really glad that Little Manila is partnering with UC Merced.
Yeah, thank you. You have a right to know what's in your air. And the truth is, it's no mystery who put it there.
Matt Holmes, Little Manila Rising's environmental justice guru, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, there's got to be a better term than that. Thank you.
Really, thank you for sitting down and talking about this. We'll get into some of the the politics maybe later at some point, but one of the things that is the Little Manila story is just the strategy, what you're doing.
Well, this was great. This kind of sets up the why of this work, and I'd love a chance to share with you Merced as a focus, Skywatch, that Skywatch project, and then the TCC project, because they're both paying people who never would have been paid environmentalists. So we're creating jobs, a future for jobs that don't hurt the community, that help the community.
Matt Holmes, who heads up the environmental policy actions at Little Manila Rising, a Stockton nonprofit that continues to evolve with its Filipino-based community needs. It all matters. It hasn't given up on itself, its people, or on Stockton. Thank you again for listening to my interview with Matt Holmes of Little Manila Rising. Here's a reminder, you can catch Emil Amok's Takeout, the live stream, both live and recorded on my Emil Guillermo YouTube page and on my emilguillermo.media Facebook page. It's on daily, Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific. Recordings also at amok.com. AMOK, that's amok.com. And so this is, once again, remember, the live stream is one thing, the daily show, but this is the podcast. It's special. And you can get them and share them on Apple Podcasts or wherever you like to podcast. Stitcher, we're on Stitcher. But mostly on Apple Podcasts, go there. And also on, if you have an Android phone, on the Google, podcast thing. Oh, also iHeart Radio podcast. This is Emil Amok's Takeout. Thank you for listening. I'm Emil Guillermo.